Welcome everyone to this pre-recorded lecture in lieu of our class time on Tuesday, September 15th. As I mentioned, I really hate having to be away from class. It's for reasons beyond my control, and this should be the only time this semester where we need to do this. So I want to take a few minutes. I'm not going to spend as long on the video as I would if we were together in the classroom, but I do want to take a few minutes and just review briefly some of the things that we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks. And I want to read a section of Plato's Republic that I had intended to get to last Thursday, but we were into some good discussion. I didn't quite make it that far. I want to talk about the beast, the analogy of the beast that Socrates gives. And then I want to say a little bit about Aristotle's four causes. So just by way of a brief review, just to reiterate a couple of points from last week and the week before. Philosophy is about first principles. So what your philosophy is, what my philosophy is, will stem from and be built upon what we hold as first principles. And this is absolutely key and crucial, and this is why I've made a point in the beginning of the semester to draw your attention to the contrast between Plato and Friedrich Nietzsche, because it's hard to think of two influential thinkers who have more opposite, more fundamentally diametrically opposed first principles. As you know by now, Plato's first principle is that there is an ultimate, divine, transcendent standard by which people are judged, and which is the ultimate standard that determines what should and should not be human behavior. As I've emphasized so very often, Plato was very adamant about the reality of an ultimate good, an ultimate truth, an ultimate beauty. And living the good life, in Plato's view, means that we are to align our thinking and our behavior to that ultimate standard, that ultimate ideal, that good. The premise, the concept, I should say, is very similar to what most Muslims, Jews, and Christians would understand in worshiping God and try to align themselves, their lives, around what they believe to be the will of God, which is the ultimate source and standard of perfection. Now, in Nietzsche's case, he wholeheartedly, lock, stock, and barrel, rejected that notion. And that's why it's Socrates in Plato's Republic who's explaining the importance of realizing this ultimate good and the standard by which we're all to be judged. And Nietzsche has a piece called The Problem with Socrates, which you remember, in which he says that all these ideas, purpose, meaning, and ideal of man, some standard or notion of the way people ought to be and the way they should be in contrast to the way we really are, Nietzsche says that's complete nonsense. These are all just fictions, inventions of men. And the fact is, there was like a certain naturalist philosopher that I've alluded to. Nietzsche says there's only one realm of reality. There's only one thing. It's the physical universe. And anytime you even consider the idea of judgment, that necessarily means that you have to have something, namely a standard of judgment, that is qualitatively different from that which is judged. All right, that's just a logical necessity that you cannot judge something unless you have something separate from that thing by which to judge it. Well, Plato says, yes, that's the transcendent, the divine ideal, the divine power. And Nietzsche says, no, there is no divine power. In fact, there's nothing but the physical universe. And because that's the only thing there is, it can never be judged. And people can't make judgments at all. The whole concept of determining how a man ought to live in contrast to how he is living, the whole concept of determining what one's purpose or meaning, or again, the way that they should live their lives, in Nietzsche's view, is completely nonsensical, because you can't judge the universe when there's nothing but the universe. Well, again, one of the reasons I start out by emphasizing that stark contrast between those two very influential thinkers is to highlight the importance, again, of those first principles, because whether or not a person embraces Plato's view or Nietzsche's view has an absolutely fundamental radical effect, implication on the way that they live their lives and on the way that they, very importantly, make decisions about right and wrong. I emphasized last week that when it comes to Nietzsche's philosophy, when you hold this view called naturalism, and we'll get into this in more and talk about this issue about the implications of naturalism when we get in just a couple of weeks to our section on the philosophy of religion. But one of the things I emphasize with Nietzsche's view is that if you hold the notion that he does, if you embrace his philosophy, that there is no reality that transcends the physical universe, then you could never, ever define morality by principle. You could only ever conceive of morality as pragmatism. So maybe if it's helpful to remember it, in the Nietzschean view, in the naturalist view, if you hold that there is nothing that transcends the physical, then you can't have morality by principle, only for the practical. All right, only for practical results. In that case, morality is to a society what oil is to a car engine. It's neither good nor bad. It's not moral or immoral, good or evil. It's just necessary to keep the thing running. It's a necessity. It's a logistical, practical necessity, but it's not it's not something that's a value in and of itself. And again, we'll come back and talk more about this in a couple of weeks, and we'll talk about it in more depth, and we'll talk about a number of different angles on this whole issue of what we believe about ultimate reality and how that affects our understanding of ethics. I wanted to, with that in mind, draw your attention to Plato's or Socrates, say Plato's through Socrates in the Republic. I wanted to draw your attention to his explanation of the beast, and specifically the beast as an analogy of how the ones he calls the sophists, the false teachers, the ones who are only concerned with, again, practical results, those who are only concerned with what's useful, not just what's truthful. He has them in mind when he makes this analogy. And listen to what he says. He says, "Why, that all those mercenary individuals whom the many call sophists, and whom they deem to be their adversaries, do in fact teach nothing but the opinion of many, that is to say, the opinions of their assemblies. And this is their wisdom. I might compare them to a man who should study the tempers and desires of a mighty strong beast, who is fed by him. He would learn how to approach and handle him, that is the beast, also at what times and from what causes he is dangerous or the reverse, and what is the meaning of his several cries, and by what sounds, when another utters them, he is soothed or infuriated. And you may suppose further that when by continually attending upon him he has become perfect in all this, he calls his knowledge wisdom, and makes of it a system or art which he proceeds to teach, although he has no real notion of what he means by the principles or passions of which he is speaking, but calls this honorable and that dishonorable, or good or evil, or just or unjust, all in accordance with the taste and tempers of the great brute. Good he pronounces to be that in which the beast delights, and evil to be that which he dislikes. And he can give no other account of them except that the just and noble are the necessary, having never himself seen, and having no power of explaining to others the nature of either, or the difference between them, which is immense." So here, with this analogy of the beast, Plato very eloquently explains, and you might say he anticipates, what are the necessary conclusions that must be held by those who, like Nietzsche, who came so many centuries later, but nonetheless, the logical necessity is the same. The conclusions that must be held by those who reject Plato's first principle, that there is a transcendent standard, that there is a divine judge, you might say. There is a way, there's a realm of ideals to which we all should be striving and aligning ourselves. Plato says if you reject that, if that is something that you do not embrace, well, the only other option left there is that defining good and evil, right and wrong, honor and dishonor, it has to be, all those things have to be defined only in terms of pragmatism, of practical results. And I think this analogy of the beast is really poignant, because it is clearly a situation where there's no standard. There's simply this concern for what works and what doesn't work, what makes the beast furious and what makes it pleased, what makes it dangerous, and vice versa. And what are the things it likes and doesn't like, and study it so that you know the times best to feed it and the times best to leave it to sleep, and so forth. But there's no standard. There's simply concern for, again, practicality, for what works. And this really caught my attention for a number of reasons, but one of them is the pertinence of this analogy in our consumer-driven society. And as I often say, if ever in the history of the world there was a culture or society that could be rightfully described as a consumer society, it is us. No question about it. And that's would take us too far afield to talk about why that's the case, but it is the case. We, in the United States and most of the Western world, we live, eat, and breathe as consumers. Everything, it seems, most things at least, are commodities. And those service providers, those producers want to produce more and more commodities so that we consumers will buy them and keep the economy going. Well, I'm not saying that's good or bad, right or wrong on this point, but the thing, in light of Plato's beast analogy, the thing to consider is, in just let's isolate the point to just the realm of commerce, the law of the economic law of supply and demand. Where does a consideration for right and wrong come into that? And should something be supplied simply because it's demanded? And at what point do we discern and say, I'm not sure this really is, yes, many people will buy this, but I'm not sure that means it should be sold. So, for example, what about pornography? There's certainly a huge market, and the providers in that field have a very cost-effective, very highly efficient way of delivering the product, you might say, through the internet. And there seems to be no shortage of demand. But does that mean that it's good, or that it should be supplied? It should be propagated in the way that it is, because it produces a lot of dollars every year, and it meets a need. But is what's going on there, is it just a matter of the provider studying the beast and finding out what the beast wants and what it doesn't want and acting accordingly? And that is a pretty stark and sordid example. But back that down a little bit from, let's say, just explicit pornography. What about the objectification of women? What about the sexualizing of women and people of both genders for advertisement's sake, and using sex appeal to sell things? Is this a matter of just studying the beast and finding out what appeals to it and what doesn't, and going accordingly? Is there, so the point here, and the question I'm driving at, is in endeavors like that, particularly in advertising, commerce, and when the supplier is sometimes trying to create demand from its customer base, is Plato's analogy a really apt one to describe what's going on there? Or is there some sort of standard that is distinct from, transcendent of, the economic process by which people are saying, aside from how many people want this, aside from how easily and cost effectively we could provide it, is it the right thing to provide? Is it good for people? Is it good for society? Is it something that should be bought and sold? Well, if that question is not asked, if there's no standard to appeal to, then it's just a matter of studying the beast. And hold that thought. And this is one of the points where I lament having to do a pre-recorded lecture, because I would really like to hear your thoughts on this. So just hold that in mind, maybe make a note of that for next time. And ask yourself, where are examples in our culture, and maybe in your personal experience, maybe in what you see on TV or on social media, what's an example of people, maybe companies or certain institutions, people in authority, not ever stopping to ask about honor or dishonor, good or evil, right or wrong, but just studying the beast to figure out what it wants and when it wants it and how it wants it, so that it can provide what the beast needs. And what are some examples of people defining success and defining a good way of life by a process that essentially boils down to studying the beast in Plato's sense? So keep that in mind, and I'd like to consider that and maybe discuss it in class on Thursday. Well, with that being said, I just want to take a few minutes to introduce to you Aristotle's four causes. Aristotle's Plato's one-time student and later colleague. I want to introduce you to his four causes. Before I get there, I want to say a little bit about Aristotle, and this helps shed a little bit light on why he would be the one to focus on these four causes. One of the things Aristotle was very much known for was classification, to take a general field and break it down into as specific categories as possible. So you see there on the screen, he focused, in contrast to Plato, Aristotle focused a lot of attention on the objects of the physical world and trying to put those in certain categories. When you study biology, the taxonomy of genus, kingdom, phylum, species, this is very Aristotelian. And he was known to gain a full understanding of something. He sought to classify the thing as much as possible: biological entity, an animal, a dog, a poodle, a toy poodle. So breaking things down and getting as specific category as possible in order to truly identify something, to know its true and full essence. All right, that's what he was known for. So in light of that, he talks about not just what things are, but part of understanding what they are is understanding how they came to be. And that's where the four causes come in. So here they are on the screen. First off is the material cause, which is probably the most simple and straightforward one. It's just the material out of which something is made, as in shoe leather for a shoe, wood for a cabinet. I used the analogy a couple of weeks ago about the distinction between matter and form. And when the contractor comes onto the lot that's filled with building materials, all the materials, those are the material cause of the house that's about to be built. Okay, and then there's the efficient cause, that by which something is made. So in that analogy, the efficient cause of the house is the contractor himself. So there's a material out of which the thing is made, and the efficient cause by which the thing is made, which is a person. And then, as I emphasized with that analogy, there's the formal cause, or the form to which the matter is aligned or formed to. Right? So the formal cause is that into which something is made. That is the idea or the picture or the blueprint that the contractor has in his or her mind when he looks at the material. And that material comes to be in the shape of a house because, in other words, that which causes it to become a house is the form in the mind of the contractor. All right, that's the formal cause. And then finally, there's the final cause, that for the sake of which something is made. And here, the central concept, central word is purpose. All right, it's one thing, you got the materials, okay, fine, that's material cause. You got the person with the skills to put the materials together, that's the efficient cause. The person has an idea to put that house, to put those materials into the form of the house, you have the formal cause. But what about purpose? Because that contractor could build, let's say, not just a house, but a building, maybe a really large house. Okay, so the contractor with his skill is the efficient cause, with the right materials, the material cause, with the picture in his mind, the blueprint he holds in his mind is the formal cause. Well, he could build a massive house with many, many different rooms, and he could use that house. Once that house is finished, the purpose of the house could be, let's say, a homeless shelter that brings in people who are desperately poor and in need of job training and enables them to get on their feet, trains them with skills to go out and flourish in life. Or that exact same building could be used as a brothel, as a house of prostitution. Well, if all you have is the material, the efficient, and the formal cause, just as my point earlier, the first day of class, about the hammer, if all you have is those three causes, that doesn't tell you what it's finally for. In other words, what the purpose is. All right. So This is interesting because the concept of a final cause, in other words, of a distinct set purpose, and this is very much like Plato's concept of an ideal. This is not nearly as widely embraced as it was, certainly as it was in their time, up until the last, say, 300 years. But in modern times, in the modern era, and I think this is something that seems to be becoming more and more the case over the years since that period that we call the Enlightenment, which again we'll talk more about soon. The idea of a final cause, particularly as it applies to individual people, has become controversial. It is not something taken for granted, and it is certainly not as widely embraced as it was for many centuries. And that is a really interesting question, and one I will leave you with, and hopefully we can take back up in class on Thursday. And that is there a final cause? In other words, is there a distinct purpose for a human being? The other analogy that's often associated with Aristotle is that of an acorn and oak tree. So I think I referenced earlier, and the concept very similar. Some might say it's synonymous of purpose is the Greek word telos, which means, again, there's a way, there's an objective that's inherent within the thing. So the telos of an acorn is an oak tree. When that acorn is planted, when it's fertilized and it starts to sprout up, it is it's growing toward its final cause, which is the oak tree. There is something that acorn is supposed to be. There is a purpose for its existence, and that purpose is to grow into a healthy oak tree. So, interesting thing to ask, and sometimes quite controversial, is the same true for a human being? Is there a certain kind of person and a certain kind of life that every person is supposed to grow up into? And I know I'm repeating myself a little bit because we talked about this about 3 weeks ago. But again, this is like the culmination of Aristotle's four causes, this final cause. Is there such a thing? Is it necessary for human flourishing? Is it set before us so that we have to grow into it? Or is it the case that every individual's purpose is decided upon, is, you might say, created by that individual and no other? Now, some discernment is called for here, because certainly to an extent, all of us determine what we want to focus on and what we want to pursue in life. And to a degree, we probably would all agree that we determine our purpose in some degrees, in some ways or others. But this is in an ultimate sense, in a general sense. And even if you're a mathematician and I'm a philosopher, or if I'm an engineer and you are a veterinarian, okay, we're in very different tracks of life. We've chosen different career purposes or tracks, you might say. But Aristotle's questions about human nature is, no matter what our field is there a way, is there a kind of person that we're supposed to be, regardless of whether we're a veterinarian or an engineer? Is there a certain qualities, certain ways about us that we're supposed to be growing into, in the way that the acorn is supposed to be growing into the oak tree? What do you think? So again, we'll bring this back up and discuss some on Thursday. I appreciate, again, your flexibility with the pre-recorded lecture, and I'm looking very forward to being back in the classroom with you soon. So take care, and I will look forward to seeing you then.